It's getting ever so hard to marry in Israel. Many Israelis are not allowed to marry in Israel. Simply put, there is no civil marriage in Israel. Others simply opt to not have a religious marriage, marry outside of Israel. But now with the coronavirus pandemic, they cannot do that either.
All right, so now we're talking a lot about Jewish law as well and how that pertains to marriage. How do marriage and divorce laws work in Israel? Because it isn't only Jewish law here.
That's a great question. In most Western countries, the authority to judge matters relating to divorce is in the hands of the family court. But here in Israel, marriage and divorce are under the jurisdiction of both the rabbinical court and the family court. So the legal systems of both of these courts are authorized to take care of these matters regarding divorce. So unfortunately, where they overlap gets really murky.
In Israel, marriage can only be approved by religious rabbinate courts. Also, marriage must be based on the Jewish religion. However, not all Israelis, according to the Chief Rabbinate, are Jewish, including immigrants and converts, among others. This has been the case since 1947. The generations then understood. But now the younger generations, and with the influx of Soviet immigrants, things are changing, and not necessarily for the better. Israelis who cannot marry are having a hard time leaving Israel to do so. In Israel, there are no marriage registrations for Israelis who opt for a non-religious ceremony or those turned away by the rabbinate. Usually, thousands of Israelis in Israel who cannot marry under religious Israeli law do so outside of Israel. But this year, the coronavirus pandemic has prevented many from doing so. In Israel, there is no such a thing as civil marriage or divorce. Israel allows marriages to be held only under religious law, banning those who cannot or will not comply with the rabbi's demands from marrying. This is because marriage and divorce, among others, are under the jurisdiction of the courts of the Chief Rabbinate in Israel. Ultimately, this entity gets to decide what or who is Jewish and what or who is not. Under the Chief Rabbinate's orders, converts, non-Jews, and immigrants cannot marry in Israel. Under Israeli law, marriage and divorce resides with religious authorities, but a growing number of couples have opted not to involve the rabbinate in their personal lives. The rabbinate is run by Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews who abide by legislation held over from the days of Ottoman rule over pre-1948 Palestine. In 1947, David Ben-Gurion, later the first Prime Minister of Israel, and the religious parties, which many of them were there before the influx of the white Jewish European settlers, reached an agreement that included an understanding that matters of personal status in Israel, which included marriage, would continue to be determined by religious authorities. This arrangement has been termed the status quo agreement and has been maintained despite numerous changes of cabinets ever since.
Well, you see, Israel is not a theocracy, although religion has a very powerful role. It was envisioned in the early days of the state in 1948. It was envisioned as a liberal society, but because it is a Jewish state, because the religious minority in Israel was not ready to define it completely as a secular institution, so the rabbinate has a very important role in Israel. It is part of the government, so it's not a private affair of people. The rabbinate in Israel, like in many other countries in which religion plays a prominent role, Israeli rabbis are actually government officials. They get a salary from the government. They are like a bureaucrat of the state. So marriage, because it is a very important civic institution, it is run by religious people. That's the situation in Israel. You can marry without a rabbi, but your marriage is not exactly the same thing in terms of your relations with the government. So that's the situation. Well, what people used to do, those people who did not want to marry with a rabbi, and did not want to have a religious marriage, the only option was to go and marry in civic religion outside of Israel. Usually people would go to Cyprus, and then somebody like a municipal official will marry them, because there are two mature people. They come and say, we want to marry, and then there is a civic agreement, and they can marry, and they can come back to Israel, and their marriage would be recognized as civic marriage. But now nobody can do that, or very few can do that, because nobody goes to Cyprus now. There is another option in Israel that people can marry, because you see, the Jewish marriage are defined in such a way that if you have your spouse you want to marry, the only thing you have to do is you have to stand in the company of others who are witnesses and say that you are ready to marry this woman, and she is ready to marry you, and you basically have done the social ritual of marriage. You don't need a rabbi. But in Israel, in order to get all the benefit from the state as a married couple, you have to be registered in the rabbinate. But basically, you can marry your loved one, the person you love, without any problems. There are many people who marry without the official that a rabbi officiates the marriage. You can do that. But these are not kind of, they are almost civic marriage, but they are not in the same status. So there is some vague boundaries between the different arrangement for marriage in Israel.
متخلف عقليا مش متخلف عقليا، المهم العمل هذا عمل إجرامي، عمل مش لازم يصير في كنيسة من كنايسنا اللي موجودة في الأراضي المقدسة.
The rabbinate inside Israel is very powerful, very, very powerful. They don't let to bring other laws into the state of Israel, because from the beginning of the state of Israel, they made a deal with the Zionist states, with Ben-Gurion, to have the power of marry the couples, and so they had an agreement when they founded this Zionist state. Even the Zionist state was not a religious state. They are mixing religion with Zionism. At the beginning, the Jewish religion, the religious Jews were against the Zionist state. The Zionist state was founded by non-religious Jews. So then it came a mixture between religious Jews that wanted to found these Zionist states, and they created a symbiosis between religion, Jewish religion, and Zionism and Zionist political ideas. But that's not the original Jewish religion, and it was not also the Zionist project. It is a mixture of both. Well, it could be if they have a government that doesn't include rabbis or rabbinical parties, I mean religious parties like the Shas. If they have an election and they make a deal with all the parties that are not religious, they could make something to change the law.
Yes, we have that problem. This is it was in the beginning a small problem. It was a problem that some people can say this is not really happened, but today we know this is a big problem. I am a friend in a group in Israel of lawyers and professors in law, and this is what we do. We speak about that and we do some action to stop that. I don't think we can stop that now because it's so big, but maybe we can a little bit put the light on action that happened and put the woman outside over and over again all the time. I think now in Israel we stay in very bad situation. I think we go backward, and I think that a lot of people want to say this is like religion people that make that problem, but this is not only religion people, and it's not all of the religion people. This is a group of people that they have interests, and this is what they want to do.
A top Iranian scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, was assassinated last week near Tehran. Who are the potential actors with the means and motives necessary to carry out such a terrorist attack? Join me on the next episode to find out. I'm Richard Medhurst, and this is The Communique on Press TV.
Currently, thousands of couples are not able to get married at all, since going abroad is not an option due to the coronavirus pandemic, and the Chief Rabbinate will not perform a ceremony and provide legal recognition. The Rabbinate standards and interpretations in these matters are generally used by the Israeli Interior Ministry in registering marriages and divorces. This legislation is amenable to the rabbinic establishment only. Many Israelis find they are turned away by the rabbinical authorities on the basis of Jewish law. Among them come from families who have immigrated to Israel from former Soviet republics and cannot provide the rabbinate with a required proof of their Judaism. Throughout the decades, there have been attempts to change the law. One such way as allowing civil marriages to be held by foreign governments under embassy ground. This had been thwarted by religious political parties that have historically held the deciding vote in coalition cabinets in Israel. Long before the coronavirus pandemic, hundreds of thousands of Israelis found themselves searching for options that included travel abroad or entering contractual cohabitation agreements just to validate their love and desire for family. For many Israelis, it has been and remains unacceptable that a person who is a citizen of Israel, a productive and law-abiding member of society, still does not have the most basic right to marry in Israel. This is why many are now calling for full civil marriage in Israel, which does not require any contact with the rabbinate for those who do not want it.
Well, the official government personnel will not help them very much, because in Israel, in order, for example, a young couple get married, if they want to go and get, let's say, mortgage to buy their first home from the government, some kind of assistance, they would not be able to do that because they are not recognized as a married couple. Okay? But for any practical purposes, they can be married. And there is a special status for people like that. For example, a man and a woman can live together, and they are, for all practical purposes, are married if they live together and they share their life. They don't need the official stamp. But if you need some official assistance from the government, for example, in questions of will and in question of inheritance and in question of buying a house and all that, so the government intervenes and it says, no, if you want our support, the government support, you need to be married according to our rule. And our rule are religious rule. That's the situation in Israel. So to some extent, it is a very troubling situation. Many people don't like it. Many people don't want the rabbi intervene in their life because, for example, if you want to divorce later on, you have to do it with some agreement of the rabbinate. Well, the rabbinate is a very powerful institution, but you see, it is not, its power is not unlimited. It is quite limited, but they are very powerful. Why? Because they command and they control civic relations that people are so important for people, the question of marriage. Because you see, because Israel is defined as a Jewish state, Judaism has a very profound role in the political arrangement of the country. So the political parties who are religious parties throughout the years were national system, but also in the religious sphere. So they are very powerful, but not unlimited force. The civil authorities also can limit their power. Yes, they can, but depends on what issue. For example, we have in Israel the issue of religious young people who study in religious institutions do not serve in the army. And many people resent that because they think that if you are a citizen, like everybody else, you have to pay taxes, you have to work, and you have to serve in the army like everybody else. In Israel, now it's quite a sizable minority of people who do not work and they study. And what they call that their studies is their work, because they study religious things. And the political parties who are religious parties defend their right not to serve in the army and not even to work, and that's especially a privilege for males, not so much for females. So there are many twists and many interesting things that have developed in Israel that were not like that in Jewish communities before the state of Israel.
On social media, Israelis talk about fundamental issues. Ron Miretti says, as a Jew, this rabbinate bothers me. No one should be able to tell me I'm not Jewish enough. You want to continue to lose internal support? That's how you do it. Angry Dad says Israel is now largely statutory, and there are specific laws putting family law matters, including matrimonial and divorce, in the jurisdiction of the rabbinate.
they have to go to another country. But I heard that it's a new news that the Norwegian, from Norway government made a deal, a solution that they could marry by civil law in their embassy in Israel, so they don't have to travel to other countries to do that. That could be to Arabs, immigrants, not religious people, LGBT community, etc., etc. You know, this law in Israel, it's a mixture of secular law inherited by the British rule. The British inherited all the law except the marriages, the civil law for the marriages and the family law. So it is a mixture. It is not a theocratical law. It is not a democratically law. It is some mixture. So it has to be a solution to help all these people who wants to marry and make some changes in this kind of mixture law between religious and secular judges.
تكون الخسائر كتير كبيرة لهذه الكنيسة. السبب طبعا مش معروف، الشرطة لازم تحقق ولازم تعرف ليش واحد دخل هذه الكنيسة علشان يحرقها.
Norway has offered to allow Israelis to get civil marriages at their embassy and consulate, as coronavirus restrictions have prevented them from traveling to Cyprus. Cyprus is a common destination for civil marriages. The issue is being debated, but it's not new. The concept of allowing Israelis to marry on foreign embassy grounds has been proposed before, but religious political parties did not allow it then. And now many believe that they will not allow it to happen, even in these distressful, uncertain times. This is why many in Israel despise the rabbinate. More and more Israelis are calling for its disbandment. Of course, that would be highly unlikely, as it is too powerful and it's essentially part of the Israeli regime. For now, Israelis just can't have a civil marriage. Here's the news making the press in Israel. Ynet News. A report by the Hotline for Refugees and Migrants NGO describes subhuman conditions and treatment akin to torture, such as being hit with belts, lack of contact with the outside world, and just moments of free time in the open air. The report by the Hotline for Refugees and Migrants for 2019 gathered dozens of testimonies, which also revealed shocking incidents at several migrant detention facilities where those suspected of visa violations, illegal entry, or unauthorized arrival are detained while the authorities work to find out if they are residing in Israel legally. The Times of Israel. Weekly protests against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continue amid wintry weather as demonstrators gathered in plazas, intersections, and overpasses throughout and across Israel for the rallies, now on their 22nd week. Police detained 4 people during the rally, and a woman in her 60s was taken for medical treatment after allegedly being shoved to the ground by a cop. The Jerusalem Post. Israel police is expected to submit indictments against leaders of the protests against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the coming days. The indictments are expected to be for offenses such as obstructing an on-duty officer and violence against police officers. Senior police officers have said that a lot of pressure has been applied to the state attorney to approve the indictments, according to Haaretz. Police must have state attorney authorization for indictments, including those that they are able to issue independently. This is designed to prevent the police from being able to limit freedom of speech. Globes. Governor of the Bank of Israel, Amir Yaron, presented a forecast of a debt GDP ratio of 87% in 2023 without spending cuts. Israel will have to make substantial budget cuts starting from 2022 in order to avoid a downgrade of its credit rating. Governor of the Bank of Israel, Amir Yaron.